Today we want to go over our post-production process, our editing, when we're using Infuse. And our goal here is to be consistent with what we're doing and producing the best results in the quickest time possible. So just being efficient, producing a good quality product consistently between all of our editors. Okay, so step one is going to be auto exposure. And we've never used auto exposure in the past necessarily. We've kind of had a manual way of setting the global adjustments as far as exposure. But Lightroom is doing a really good job right now with that. So it's a good starting point. We still want to double check and make sure everything's right, which is a pretty quick process, and we'll go over that in just a minute. And the only thing we don't like about auto exposure as a starting point is that it does bump up the saturation and vibrance and the color. So the next step, we're going to have a preset that will set those back to 0 and a few other things. So in this data set, we were using it from a previous video, and included are all the original raw files that we used for the Infuse. So if you're downloading these pictures from as an editor from the photographer, you're not going to have these additional images here, these stacks of raw files. You'll just have the single shots that they took, which for me are the ones marked in red here, and then the infused or the fused images towards the bottom. Now, since I have the originals in here to make things a little more simple, I've sorted them by added order. So if you're a photographer and you're doing your own edits, then you could select this option to put your fused images towards the bottom. And what we want to do is just go in and apply the auto exposure, and I'm just doing Command U for a shortcut, to all of these pictures, fused images here. And then I'm going to change the sort order to label color, because I previously marked the single shots in red, and I'm going to do a auto exposure on those. So now I have the first step done on all these. Okay, before we go to the next step, I do want to go over the manual process of how we make adjustments to the exposure of an image. And this is using the global adjustments, so the tools that affect the entire picture. So what we'll do is we'll take these three images and we'll start off with the auto exposure. So I did a Command U to get that. And when I look at these pictures, they're pretty close. If you look at them, all three of them, except for this one, the overexposed is a little bit brighter, but these other two are really close. But let's just see how much closer we can get them looking at the manual process of setting the exposure. So first of all, let me make sure I'm in develop mode. I'm on the first image, which is the midtone image. And I'm going to look first at the midtones. And the reason I want to start with the midtones is because that's the foundation of your image. That's where the bulk of your data will be in almost every scene. So technically that should typically be in the middle of the histogram pretty much. But looking at the image, and it looks pretty close, I'm looking at just the primary subject, which is where I want the midtones set. And that's going to be the side of the building and the walkway here. And I'm just looking to see what looks good, what's proper exposure. And you can push this a little bit too bright. You can look at it too dark to try to find what center is. But that looks pretty good for a midtone exposure there. Now next we want to look on the far edges of the data. So all the way in the blacks and all the way here in these whites. And you can do either one first, it doesn't matter. So we'll start with the blacks, and I'm just going to make sure that this triangle lights up. And the reason I'm doing that is because in every picture, you're always going to have something in the blacks, typically, unless you're shooting polar bears in a snowstorm maybe. So you'll have wood grain, you'll have a black TV, something with black in image. So you're going to have data starting at least right here at 0. And this triangle should be lit up. You shouldn't have like a gap there, if you will. So I'm just going to make sure that data is set right, and then I'm going to do the same thing on this side with the brightest pixels, and just let this triangle light up. But once we finish that, we've we've looked at the midtones, we've looked at the blacks, we've looked at the whites. Now we're just going to go to the left of the midtones, which is your shadows, and the right of the midtones, which is your whites. And we just want to make sure those are set properly. Now, these are a little bit more subjective on what looks good to you. Just like the midtones, I like to push those too far on either direction and kind of see what seems balanced to me. And that looks pretty good there. And then I want to look at the same thing here on the highlights. I want to see about if I push them up, you know, the sky's blowing out. If I pull these all the way down, I get some nice blue in the sky here. Now you notice this triangle kind of went away when I did that, so I might just kind of pull that back up a little bit. So pulling down this section, which is the opposite of the shadows, if you will. So now everything is set properly, and the image looks pretty good. Now at this point, don't worry if the picture, especially when we deal with indoor shots, if the picture doesn't have like the pop, you know, the highs, because we're going to add those later. Right now we're looking at is just proper exposure. A lot of times editors will overexpose an image to make it look bright, and we don't want to do that. We want proper exposure as our foundation, and then we can do some things to bring those highs in and bring in that pop and make it look bright, nice and bright. So this is properly exposed. Let's go to the next one. Let's see what the computer did. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to adjust these real quick. Starting with midtones, triangles lit up here, triangles lit up on the right. Let's look at the shadows. Shadows look pretty good there. And let's see, bringing that sky a little bit. Okay, that looks good. Let's go to the next one. Check it. Okay, midtones looks good there. Blacks. Let's make sure that's properly set. All right, and then over here, bringing that sky. Okay, so let's compare these three now. So we have our original midtone, our underexposed image, and then our brightest, our highlight image, which this one is, you know, a little more loss of data over here in the sky, but all pretty close. Now let's look at to see what auto exposure does with computer. Compare that again. Okay, so we had this one as a midtone, this one as the dark, this is a little too dark, and then this is a little bit brighter. So pretty close to the same results. The way we did it manually, we get a little better results. So if you do an auto exposure and you're not happy with what the computer does, just do that check. You know, start with the midtones either side and then come in. But if the computer is close, we can just go with that. Okay, so final thoughts here, and what I really want to illustrate is that auto exposure does a pretty good job, especially at a starting point, and we can just tweak it from there if we need to, and how we do that. But also, I wanted to illustrate that even though these pictures were drastically different in their exposure levels, if you look at how dark like this image is compared to the others, when you do your edits to it, you can get it looking pretty good, pretty close. And it would normally be superior to a bracketed shot outside. So if you have good lighting, really consider doing a single shot, not a multiple exposure, because if you get any wind in the trees or the bushes and you get that motion blur, the picture is just going to look bad. And also a fused image a lot of times will look muted. This one here, being that we have some harsh shadows, and we don't really have any trees in the shots that would be moving, working with a fused image would probably be the best, so that'll work. But if you look at these other images like down here, these are going to edit out great. We are not going to need multiple exposures, and the blurring that we would possibly get just isn't worth it. So, and you know, the colors are nice and vibrant. You don't have that kind of muted, washed out look that you get sometimes with infused outside. So definitely use single shots outside unless it's a really harsh shadow situation. And if you're not sure, you could do it both ways and just send in both the fused image and the best mid-tone exposed shot for the outdoors. And that way the editor has both to choose from. Okay, so next we want to move to step 2, which is a simple auto preset, which is really designed to set the color and vibrance for indoor shots back to 0, and then bring in a little bit of sharpening, texture, clarity, things that you would typically do on all the pictures, just a subtle bit. So we'll build this real quick. I will say that on this preset, you don't have to use this on your outdoor shots. Normally the extra color and vibrance that the auto exposure does on the outdoor shots is pretty good. But if you wanted to, if you feel like it's a little rich, you could use the same preset on that also. Okay, so if you look at the presets here, I have a step 2 preset, and it's real simple. I'll just go ahead and apply it while we're watching it do its changes. So here I just took a picture. I'll do a Command U to do an auto exposure, and we can see that the vibrance and saturation is +14 and +2. So step 2 is going to just bump those back down to 0. It does put a little bit of an S-curve in there, in the tone curves, just a tad, just because I typically do that. And then again, down here in the sharpening and noise reduction, I'm using what I normally do on an image. I just put that in there as a starting point as well. So that's pretty much it for this preset. The way you would save that is you would create a new preset. You can call it step 2 or whatever you want. And I would go in and just check off what you want it to save. So we're looking to make a little bit of the tone curves. In the color, we have saturation and vibrance. And then texture, clarity, sharpening, just the things that you've set that you want it to remember. And we can call this step 2, whatever you want to call it, which I already have one, so I won't save it. And then we use that on all the inside shots, and you could use it on the outside shots too. If you just go back and look at your outside shots with the auto exposure, if the colors look a little too rich, too saturated, you can just use this preset on them also. But typically the outside looks pretty good with what auto exposure does with that extra bump in the color and saturation. Okay, now step 3, which is our auto white balance or our white balance. This is at a point where we want to make sure our colors are going to look right, our temperature looks right. And if the photographer did their part as far as setting a neutral white balance on the raw files before they infuse them, you shouldn't have much to do here. You're just looking to see if the picture looks, as close as good. I normally use the dropper tool. You could do an auto white balance, which is a Command-Shift-U, and see what the computer does. A lot of times I like to use the dropper tool just because I can have more control over what I'm wanting to set it to. I normally look for what's kind of a mix between the outdoor light and any incandescent light coming in. I do favor the natural light when I'm picking, because if you just split the middle, you're compromising a little bit. The natural light really is the dominant light, and it's going to give the most accurate colors. So the two approaches to white balance is that you could go with natural light only, but if I click on something like down here that I know is influenced just by natural light, we're getting a lot of yellow from the artificial lights. If I go in here and choose the artificial lights, then it's very cold. So you can kind of split the difference between the middle, pick something that's kind of a mix between the two lights where you have both influences going on. But I do tend to favor more of the natural light rather than the artificial light, because it's going to give me the best overall color. Because we can address the warm yellows and oranges that are coming off the incandescent lights a little bit later. So I guess what I'm saying is a foundation, when you're setting white balance, favor more of the natural light, get that looking really good, and then we can address these other colors. So let's just look through here just a couple of these. This one, let's go ahead and take it from the beginning what we have so far. We have an auto exposure step 1. With auto exposure, we just want to make sure that our midtones are right, blacks. Just kind of look at this, make sure it looks good. You can tweak it a little bit with that process we talked about. You don't want to worry about if it doesn't have its pop right now. We'll address that in a few minutes. But right now, we just want proper exposure. Then we hit the step 2, which is to do some tweaks with the sharpening and all, and set those colors back to 0 for now. And then step 3, which is the white balance, we're just looking to see if the white balance looks good. And this looks good without even messing with anything. So if it's off a little bit, let's go to something that might look off. Let's go to, just go look in, maybe in here. This is off a little bit. So let's do, I think we already did an auto exposure, we did, then a step 2, and then let's look at the white balance. I'll just kind of click around here what I think looks good. That looks a little bit better, a little warmer. So you just want to get the white balance right. Let's look at this one. This is step 2, and then white, this is a little hot, so let's bring that down a little bit. Everything else looks good. And we will click on this. This is a little cold, but I'll go from here and just warm it up a little bit. All right, time for the next step, which will be step 4. Now, I did have this step right here, which is verify in order exposure, whites, blacks, shadows, highlights, contrast. We've talked about that. And I had that after the white balance. I had that as step 4. I recently just moved it up here because when I was doing this video, I was really doing that part after the auto exposure. But really, this could be done after the white balance. You could do it up here when you're doing your exposure. The thing is that if the picture is off on the white balance, if it's too warm or if it's too cold, it's really going to be hard to do this step of verifying that your exposure is correct. So if you're looking at a picture and you do your auto exposure, your white balance looks good, you can go ahead and just do this step here, which is, make sure everything is right, just kind of tweaking it. And then you can apply your preset, just tweak your white balance. But if your white balance is really off, where it's really warm or really cold, you may not be able to. You may have to do the white balance before you actually approach that. So just a little variation there. But this next step, step 4, this is where we're going to start correcting the yellows and the oranges in our shot. So let's go ahead and go back to our Lightroom here. Okay, so actually I'm going to pull up another job because in the data set we were working on, and there wasn't really a huge influence of the incandescent lights where I had any examples that had a lot of orange or yellows in it, partly because I did a pretty good job at white balancing the raw images before I fused them, which really helps a lot. So anyway, I've got a couple of pictures here in a different data set that we can work on a little bit. So let's start with this one. We'll do the auto exposure first. We'll go ahead and do the step 2 and set those colors back to 0. Then we will just check our exposures and everything. They all look good where they are, so we really don't need to change anything there. We want to do an overall white balance, so I just want to kind of look around here and see what looks good, favoring natural light just a little bit, but let's see here, maybe a little bit more, try to pull some of those, get some of those yellows out there. All right, so we see some yellow here around this light, and we've got an overall yellow influence. So what I'm going to do now is do a Command Option Shift L. Command Option Shift L is a shortcut for it on Mac. But that is basically this HSL color panel. It's the Luminous tool, and it's this little tool here, this little icon. You click on it, and now anything you click on in the picture, as far as a color, you can illuminate that up. So you can see the influence of the incandescent here. We can have it over here. So I don't think I'll try it over here. I'm just going to take and illuminate that up. And you can see it's almost like pulling up the lights, because that is the incandescent color mostly. And what we want to do is we want to pull that up a little bit just to get that brightness, not too much, but we want to pull it up to get that brightness into that upper scale. Let's see here. All right. Now, what we want to do now is desaturate a little bit. So we're going to take the desaturation tool, which is Command Option Shift S, but it's just this saturation here and that little tool. And I'm going to click on that same color, and I'm just going to bring it down a little bit, not much, because if you go too far, you make it a black and white image. So it's very subtle. You're just wanting to desaturate just a little bit, just to cut some of that yellow and orange out. All right. So and when I do this, you might want to go back up and tweak the global exposure tools a little bit. I'm just going to add a little more contrast in here. But basically what we're doing here is taking the yellows and oranges coming from the incandescent colors and illuminating them up and desaturating a little bit. Now we haven't brought in the pop yet in the picture. We just have good overall exposure and trying to minimize the impact of these incandescent lights. The reason why too that this is what's going on is that with Infuse, it takes all the exposure data and compresses it a lot into the midtones. So some of these incandescent colors, they're not illuminated very high. They're more in the midtone range when they should be higher. So they're just the impact is very strong. You know, the oranges and yellows are just very heavy. Illuminating them up and desaturating a little bit helps a lot. Let's look at this one here. So we'll do a auto exposure. We will do a step 2, which is take those colors back down, a few little tweaks. We'll set the overall white balance. Looking in this room, probably, you know, having an impact of the natural light, which helps a lot. And then I'm going to take my luminous tool, and I'm going to illuminate up the yellows and oranges a little bit and desaturate them a little bit also. When you illuminate them up, you may pull the midtones down a bit. Again, you don't want to bring in the pop yet. You're just focused on getting a good balanced exposure and getting the colors more accurate. All right, so let's go back to our steps here, and let's just review. So we have the auto exposure. If the white balance is good, you can go ahead and verify all the exposure levels are great. If not, if it's too warm or too cold, you'll want to go ahead and hit step 2, hit step 3, and get that right first, and then try to get the exposures right. Now we're at step 4, illuminating up the yellows and oranges, if needed, just subtle, not heavy. And this is where this step here, step 5, the next step, is where it will have a big impact on the overall brightness and pop of the image. That's what we're going to do next. All right, so let's go back to our examples here, and I'll go back to my other data set also. Let's, while we're here, just work on these 2 pictures. Okay, so the next tool we're going to use is the, I call it Showcase Pop, or Pop. And I will blow this up, and so you can see it. You can also pause the video. But essentially what we're doing is we're using mostly the dehaze as the main base for this tool in the negative. So normally dehaze, if you have a lot of fog, like a foggy scene or something, you can take this dehaze and take some of that fog out. We're actually going to go backwards with it, a -7, and then we're going to bring in some clarity, texture, and a little bit of contrast to compensate for some of the negative impact of the dehaze that we're using. Essentially what this is going to do is bring in some of those highs and take out some of the dinginess in the picture, and you'll see what I mean in just a second. Again, it's a -7 dehaze, +10 clarity, +17 on the texture, and a little bit of contrast there. Right, so we want to take a brush, and we want to do a large brush. You can make it big, no feathering, and 100% flow, because we're going to be actually painting the whole picture. Now, there's a couple reasons why I'm painting it. One is I can control where I put this. Like I might want to avoid the windows a little bit. It doesn't really hurt too much if you paint over the windows, but sometimes I will just kind of paint around the windows, just very loosely. But also, the reason that we use a brush tool is that if you use the global adjustments, because you can apply dehaze and all these settings in the global, it doesn't work as well for some reason. The brush tool, when you brush it in, just works a lot better. So what you'll see is when I brush this in, I'm just going to brush 100%. And you see, if you look up in the ceiling here, I don't know if I can probably zoom in, but you can see that it just brings in a lot of the highs, a lot of the pop, and takes a lot of that dinginess out of there. Let's go back to the previous data set that I had and look at that. Let me see if I can find it real quick. All right. All right, so let's go and look at this picture. I know we had done an edit on that. I'll go to develop mode, get my brush tool, and I'm just going to paint this in. And I'll just paint in half of it. Just look up at here at the just at the ceiling. You can see the difference. It brings in a lot of highs and just takes out that dark dinginess. It's like magic. So I'll just go ahead in here and I'll just kind of paint loosely around this window. Okay. Oops, actually I got a second brush here. Let me get rid of that. Let's see where my brush is. Oh, it's over here. Sometimes I'll lose track of it. All right, so just kind of paint that in. All right, like that. And when you paint it in, sometimes you might need to bring the exposure back down just a little bit. You can always tweak any of these. You know, once you, as you're making these adjustments, if the exposure goes up, if you need a little more contrast, you can always bring some of that in. Okay. Let's look at this one here. This one was already pretty bright. So let's take the tool and let's just paint that in. You see the difference there that it makes. Okay. That looks good. Let's look at this one here. I think we've done this one. Paint this in. Look at the difference that makes. So you see here we're waiting to the last one of the last steps to really kind of bring in those highs. If you want to bring in any more than this, it's really best to go back down to the tone curves. We haven't done much of that yet. Looks like we missed a step 2 on this one. You can pull the tone curves up and bring in more highs, but again, you can't bring in too much of it. Let's go back to this one here. If I wanted to bring this up a little bit more, I can bring that up some more and bring in that pop, bring in those highs. So to bring in the pop, instead of just taking the midtones, the exposure tool, and just pulling all that up and really overexposing the picture, you're pulling up with the oranges and yellows by illuminating that up. You're pulling up just some of that data a little bit higher. The brush tool brings up a little bit more, so you're just trying to pull up these highs a little bit higher and not just pulling everything up. Let's take a look at, let's look at this one. Okay, so take and just brush that in. So you can see how that works. Let's try this one here. I don't know if we actually did an edit to this one. I don't think we did. Maybe we did. White balance looks good. Brush that in, bring the highs down a little bit. All right. So let's go to the next step. Okay, so we just brushed in the pop. The next is step 6 is a final check of the white balance. You know, once you bring that pop in, sometimes you might need to adjust the white balance a little bit. Depending on lights in the room, sometimes it might bring a little more of the green out of a artificial bulb, maybe a little bit of a red. So sometimes you have to tweak the white balance. Sometimes you might have to pull down the exposure a little bit as you're moving these things around. But the last step is just fix level and cropping. Sometimes, to be honest, I actually do this at the very beginning because this getting it level is kind of annoying to me. It's hard for me to edit a picture that's off level like this one. It just kind of bugs me. So sometimes I will do this step first. And this is good. This happened. On this particular picture, the auto level didn't work. Typically what I do is I'll do a Shift T to get this transform tool up. I'll hit the vertical, and always use vertical, and see how that works. If it doesn't do the job, I'll go back to Shift T, which is essentially this little tool here, which is in the transform. It's a tool where you can take and draw two vertical lines, like one here, and come over here. Sometimes it's hard to get it on there. and draw another one here, and just straighten it out. And that always works. So I use this transform tool a lot. All right, so we got that straight, and now just cropping. On the vertical shots, you can unlock the aspect ratio and you can change it if you want, instead of having the aspect ratio locked. As long as it remains taller than wider, you're good. So I'm just going to maybe take a little bit of that out. And then on the horizontal images, if you crop one of these, then you need to keep this aspect ratio locked, because you want to keep it consistent in the width and the height. So whatever you crop, you want it to stay the same. So that's as vertical as you can unlock it, as long as you don't turn it into something like, you know, a box, or if you turn it into a weird horizontal. As long as it's taller than wider, that's good. Okay, so that will conclude this video. We didn't go over everything. These are just the basic technique, basic steps for our adjustments. There are some other things that we'll do at times, like cutting in windows, or if you have a room where you have a really heavy incandescent influence in part of the room, and another part of the room is very a lot of natural light, very cool. In those cases, you know, you have to brush in the areas, the anomalies, the incandescent lights. You actually have to brush those in and feather it in, and change the white balance and make spot adjustments on those. But we'll go over that in another video. On this video, I just wanted to go over the basic techniques of what we can, you know, what we'll need to do for the majority of the images. Hopefully this helps, and we'll see you on the next video.